Hello everyone, today we talk about African elephants in Hellenistic and Roman warfare. I think at this point I made only one video about Mughal armored elephants. We talked about elephant warfare a bit in the video about the Mauryan army, right? But we never addressed the issue in kind of Western ancient warfare, let's put it in this way, and concentrating on this particular species of elephants, considering that, in fact, there is a big part, especially of Hellenistic warfare proper, in a narrower sense, that is about the Asiatic elephant, right? That was used also in Africa, telling you the truth, and elsewhere, naturally also in Europe. Think about Pyrrhus, but these were in fact Indian elephants, and they are a bit different because the animals are different here, and therefore today we discuss largely this essentially Ptolemaic, early Carthaginian, and Numidian, and eventually even Roman warfare, given that these were effectively the powers that employed African elephants. Today we will not look specifically at for example, battles in which they were effectively employed, right? We made some videos at the Battle of Ilipa, for example. We discussed the employment of elephants from the Carthaginian side. So that's a bit of an old video. Maybe I will remake it at one point, but it's obvious that we will discuss extensively every single battle at one point of this period and observe the employment of elephants in those specific contexts. And always remember, no encounter is ever equal to another. You can't generalize on the employment of a certain arm, even though it's still kind of similar in every case, but still there is a tiny difference. So if we were here to do that, it would take us like hours and hours and hours. So today we concentrate just in here about African elephants and how they were employed, generally speaking. What were the differences also with the Indian elephant, and especially concerning the employment of turrets, etc., and more in general, what was effectively elephant warfare in these times, because there are some doubts about certain aspects. There are actually we know of a relatively few, right? The problem with ancient history at this point is that we often lack substantial and structural evidence about how armies in general fought at the time. In popular culture, ancient warfare is kind of more popular, I would say, from a strictly kind of analytical point of view, historically analytical point of view, than I don't know, the Middle Ages or even later times in certain cases, because we think essentially we know everything. There is a positivistic answer for all the problems, for all the questions we can pose. And if you look at the sources instead, you realize that we don't know very much. The evidence is fairly scanty, and especially sometimes it's not really reliable. Like the fact that there is the mention of one thing happening doesn't mean that it was actually true. Doesn't mean that the source was close to the events. Here we're talking even about half of a millennium of distance in certain evidence. Sometimes there were mistakes of transcriptions, and in general you should get a bit into the habit of considering ancient literature for what it was effectively at the time. Who wrote these things, why, right? And overall, like, we are fairly well documented. This is definitely a period in our history which we get, considering the distance in time, a fair amount of information, but still we should be cautious, as always, to contextualize, to translate properly, and to have to be open to interpretation, but also be consistent about what this actually meant, especially in kind of militarily logical terms, which is not easy if you are not used to those specifically, right? There is a classicistic approach towards ancient sources, for which it's just about a matter of philology, translating the thing with the semantic shade, but maybe having never studied a battle in that regard. That is a problem, because actually you need both. It's the other way around. A lot of people studied battle, but maybe they don't even know the original languages. For example, I don't know ancient Greek. Like, I can translate it in part, but I've never studied it, so I have my limits in this field. But also translations can be tricky. All these texts naturally are open source, like they're available everywhere. It's full of translations online, very prestigious scholars who dedicated them, but mistakes are all over the place, right? So you have to also develop a bit more of ear. We can say. Talking about the African elephant proper, what are we talking about? Essentially, we're talking about this small African forest species, right? The so-called Loxodonta africana cyclotis in Latin, right? And we don't know exactly, first of all, what this kind of animal really this was, whether it's actually similar to the elephants that still exist today. And this species, in fact, is extinct because there are still African elephants of the Loxodonta africana type, right? And they live in the savannas of Central and Southern Africa, right? But these instead were animals native to North Africa and belonging to the now extinct, in fact, species of Loxodonta africana cyclotis, or also known, I think, as Loxodonta atlantica for this reason, because I think it takes name from the atlas and this broader North African area. And these elephants were still living in the Punic area of Berberia at that point, isolated in the region after the desiccation of the Sahara and malnourished from lack of vegetation. And it seems, however, that they existed elsewhere, and in fact the better documentation we have from about them is not the the most typical Punic and in fact also Berber interland area that unfortunately has really not it doesn't have a voice. First of all, because the Romans razed them to the ground in part. Secondly, because they objectively had a kind of a bit of a different culture. But we know this fairly from the Ptolemies, right? So from Ptolemaic Egypt, that these elephants were hunted in modern Eritrea and Somalia and Numidia. And they were, in fact, used in this broader area by the Ptolemies, by the Carthaginians, Numidians, as we've seen before. That were effectively the power, the major power existed in North Africa at the time. And there is a Ptolemaic inscription which differentiates between the Ethiopian and the troglodytic elephants, right? Albeit we don't understand whether it was a speciological distinction. Actually, it could refer more simply to the area where they were hunted, and therefore not any difference regarding race. So the African forest elephant, talking about size, was something like between 215 centimeters to 245 centimeters tall, right? So substantial, more between 2 meters, 2 meters and a half at the shoulder, of course. And they were shorter than the Indian elephant that could arrive up to even more than 3 meters. Surely much smaller than the great African bush elephant that was not used in war, which instead can be up to 4 meters actually. So they were relatively small beasts. Still, that's the characteristic of the elephant. That's still an imposing animal. A lot of mass and substantial strength, and this naturally could be employed with particular training in warfare as well. There were various ways. There were stories. I think they were kept in captivity, even growing kind of angry, like and becoming evil in some sense, because they were deprived. They were captive in the etymological sense of the world. I don't know whether this is true, but objectively, yes, they had to be trained in some way. Usually animals were scared, even with the sounds of trumpets, etc., and shouts, but they would have to meet in battle. The elephant, in this sense, can freak out pretty easily and become very, very dangerous. For the rest, the elephant is actually a pretty peaceful animal, and this is kind of the sad story of the situation, but there was a florid even trade of these beasts, because they were very valuable at the same time, not just for military employment, as we know, and unfortunately still today. And there was this ancient commonplace, let's say, that African elephants were smaller and weaker than the Indians properly, and that therefore could not stand up to them in battle. And this seems to be proved on several occasions, for example, at the Battle of Raphia, when the Ptolemaic elephants, and I don't think it's specified they were actually African elephants at that point, but they were considered to be smaller, and that's what we think about it. And they met with the Seleucid ones, and they basically fled. But only the fact that, however, they were fielded in that sense and still launched against other elephants, right? At that point, we should expand maybe a bit more on how even Asiatic elephants that are better documented in their employment were used, right? Because it wasn't just about smashing against enemy lines; it was also about against keeping cavalry out of the way, but also used against other elephants themselves. And in many cases, doesn't even seem that there was an actual formation where they were used on some occasions. We're kind of better documented about African elephants specifically because so much has been written about the Punic Wars, where, as we know, elephants were widely employed by the Carthaginians, and unfortunately we don't know that much from Roman employment that actually went on for a couple of centuries, even more. Telling the truth, it was still theorized at the beginning of, during the 1st century AD even, but we'll talk about this later. So the differences between the African and the Indian elephants include the African's more strongly segmented or ridged trunk ending in 2 fingers, so-called, rather than 1, like the Asian one, and the line of its back is concave or flat, while the Indians is convex. Also, the small forest elephant has rounded ears and small straight tusks. Silius Italicus, that is a later source, says that long spears were fixed to the elephant's tusks to make these even more effective weapons, as we realize tusks were used effectively to wound, to hit. But not only, that's not the only point. That's paradoxically, yes, when they charge and you have this kind of pointy thing, but it's really about the mass of the elephant in itself that creates the problem. This is important to understand because it's not just about elephants, it's also in general about all charges, including ones of chariots or horses, right? Then it's really the psychological impact. As you know, these elephants were pretty scary, especially for those populations that had never met them before, including the Romans at the beginning, before fighting against Pyrrhus, that was, by the way, also using larger elephants, the ones coming straight from India, so that even the mahouts were seemingly Indian people proper. But the same Romans employed them, for example, in Gaul, in Spain, against the barbarian populations, and well, they probably feared them. Like, at least the Spanish knew those, in the sense that, of course, the Carthaginians had already employed elephants in battle, but maybe the Barians proper knew that. The Celtic Barians in the north, where the Romans actually went fighting with their Numidian allies, maybe they had it. But it's not just about that. It's not just about the appearance. It's effectively the shock and the effectiveness of this arm. That is, naturally, it fell out of use, as we will see, but it had its space in military history, and we can naturally criticize its employment and thinking about the pros and cons, but still it was there, and if it was there, it means it was effective, and they knew better than we do today. So that's always to be borne in mind. So, although smaller, the African elephant was, however, strong enough to bear the weight of towers, crew, and armor. This is a very debated topic because it is true. I mean, in terms of muscular force and general capabilities, yes, this thing of the towered structures installed over the elephants' backs were effectively a thing of ancient warfare. The problem is we don't really understand how, right? And among the elephants were used in warfare at the time, definitely the African one was The one we had probably less reason for using them, in the sense that it was smaller, and you also have to wonder, like, what do I actually do with a tower, right? This is often rarely asked. Like, we think, yeah, there are actually representations. There is a statuette from Pompeii, for example. There are coins that show usually just actually simply men on the back of the elephants, more often than towers. Actually, we know that surely Indian elephants have had towers. I mean, at least the ones used by the Westerners, because as far as I understand, in the West at least, the first one we used towers, or at least that is documented in this sense, is Pyrrhus, right? So this is not so, it's not so obvious that you may want to use a tower on the elephant's back, for several reasons. First of all, it's an extra weight, right? I don't know honestly how long that can kind of burden the elephant. Probably not so much. I mean, if you think that even horses are loaded with sometimes with armor, with the heavily armored guy, right? What we see from elephants is just this fairly, also precarious. This is what I often wonder, how stable these structures were on the elephant's back, because yeah, the idea is clear. You want to have someone on the back of the elephant that defends the elephant from whoever wants to attack it, and it's still it's a stable animal, even if it kind of runs amok. If you're on it, you're still fairly stable on it. You want to have especially firepower, in my opinion. Like, you want especially troops to stay out of the way. So you basically, if you combine the elephant charge with plus this idea, there's even projectiles falling on you in the air before suffering the impact. Well, that's useful, and it kind of makes sense. And I'm actually favorable to the idea that there were javeliners and slingers and archers on African as well as Indian elephants. The problem is that Africans also are kind of smaller, so probably aside from the mahout that had to be there, and also about this I'm not entirely sure of it, in the sense that now we'll see how elephants were effectively employed. There could be just another one or maybe two guys on the back. It's really a matter of space and also of stability of the structure of the tower itself. Also, we don't know exactly, even when we see that these structures were used, how they were made specifically. Even for the Asian elephant, we see that there are certain sources. For example, there is the Book of the Maccabees in the Bible that talks about certain battles against the Seleucids, and in one specifically, there is this notion, which is a mistake, that there were up to 32 people on the back of Seleucid elephants, which is actually a mistake of transcription. It actually meant something else that, now it's a bit too complicated to explain how the text was, but essentially the guy exchanged the troops that actually accompanied the elephants. This is actually a real thing. We've seen it even at Ilipa in part, or maybe that was a contingency, even given kind of the fact that elephants were deployed on the flanks, and that's a bit of a, we will have to come back on that one day. But there were elephants that normally people that normally escorted the elephants, and that was quite important, because there was actually the most effective way to knock out the elephant was actually sticking a spear in their butts, because literally that's the softest spot that elephants have. Elephants have thick skins, and they're so thick that they work as a sort of armor, right? Not that they don't get wounded otherwise, but it's tough to take that down, especially when this beast is kind of running amok and doesn't even listen at that point at the orders of the mahout or etc. So I don't know what. The fact that even for Indian, here we shouldn't ask things like, oh well, but in later times, I don't know, like in Mughal India, like we know they even mounted cannons on the elephant's back. That's also debatable, but I think it's been done at least for transportation, but probably also for employment in certain cases. We know that elephants sometimes were even covered in armor. that it could take these heavy loads. For sure, elephants were used actually largely also for this. They were not just weapons. They were fundamentally also from a logistical point of view. They could open the ways, taking away trees from the paths, carrying enormous weights for the army. But the question is, how should have been they used in actual combat? And the question whether there were turrets for an effective tactical advantage on a regular base, this is a bit more debatable. Like, because I think the bias is saying, oh well, but for the Asians there are better that there is better evidence in their Hellenistic armies like the Seleucids, the Epirotes, the etc. And when instead you go to the African, you say, well, those were stereotypically without. Actually, we should start to realize that the difference in the species and in the size, in fact, was not even the reason of this. You should rather ask whether that's tactically convenient or not, and what do you do with the elephant in the first place. So no doubt that elephants could bear towers. Bit more doubts what you could effectively do with these towers, what you could effectively accomplish in terms of even self-defense was up there, right? And in generally speaking, in the collective, in the overall economy of the collective formation, in which you really want to reduce everything to the essential in order to make the thing work, because already employing elephants is a pretty complicated affair. It's also pretty dangerous, so you don't want to add further problems, spend further energies for something that at the end of the day doesn't have much of a function. So for example, if you look at the Ptolemaic elephants at the Battle of Raphia, well, in there, assuming that there were actual African employed, there is sources talk about Sarissa-armed men in the towers actually fighting each other. So in that specific episode, we have implied in some way that there were guys in these towers that actually battled each other. So crew against crew, and possibly naturally also against the other elephants, like you want to stick a sarissa in the eye of the poor animal in order to knock it out. But even in there, we know that the battle was solved rather by the fact that the Ptolemaic elephants were scared of the Seleucid ones. So even at that point, this mechanicistic technical interpretation of what could do these guys on the top at that point is blurred and virtually insignificant in front of the fact that, as it happens, for example, even for cavalry, it's usually the toughest beast at that point, the size, that has an impact, that has all the psychology in it, than what you actually do with guys on the top of them, right? That can be really influent. Whether that the sarissa is this pike that was employed famously by the phalanxes at that time in these Hellenistic armies, according to them, following the Macedonian model. Pikes are spears, telling the truth. That in terms of categorizations, there is actually no difference. Like the pike is literally and exclusively definable as a long spear. There is no other way, renowningly, to define this. So what these guys did, aside from, and that's only one evidence we have. This is Polybius that talks about the specific battle, and that's a good example of what we were saying at the beginning. That's the only source we have, talking about the employment of our sarissa from in this case, from the towers of elephants, and by the crews to find each other. So, should this become general about elephant warfare? All the fighters use that in that way. Was it normal? Was it employed against, I don't know, other troops? Like elephants were notoriously effective against cavalry, also because horses freaked out in front of the elephants. But we have to think that the sarissa here were used as the sarissa were used as anti-cavalry. We have no proof. There is none of that. We don't know what it means, and the sarissa is literally just a long spear. Point. that's where the speculation can go on, but you wonder at that point how functional it is in the first place. Also, in order to use a pike on imagine yourself in a battle, like in a tower over an elephant's back, and trying to even wield a pike, right? How do you think that is gonna be so useful in the first place? Like, isn't it better to use maybe some other, like, yeah, it's possible, right? But think about all what can go wrong, right, in the process. And yeah, and consider that in that specific encounter, we're still talking about, in fact, elephant versus elephant. So we're not talking about an elephant charge, for example, against infantry, like the ones you can see at Zama or in other battles of the Punic Wars, for example, which makes it a very different type of engagement, right? If you know that your elephants are gonna go against other elephants, well, at that point, maybe your troops can be equipped really in a way that, like the Sari said, it maybe is effectively functional to fight against the enemy crew. But if you have to throw elephants, there's also usually, well, okay, let's assume even in Raphia, from the Ptolemaic side, were smaller, but, at Battle of Zama, do you think that actually Carthaginians had even someone on the elephant's back, aside from the Mahot, the first elephant of the row, and we'll see how that worked? That is difficult to say. Because at some point, war is fairly simpler than it seems in this regard, and you want actually to simplify it to maximize the effectiveness of certain tactics. So this is yet to be seen. The interesting thing, talking a bit more about the Berber side of the story, when we talk about King Yuba's Numidian elephants, for example, so we're talking about late in time, 1st century BC. This is Yuba II. We're talking about the times of the of Caesar's civil war, right? When basically these Numidian allies were levied by the senators, let's say, the Pompeians, against Caesar, that effectively got rid of them at Battle of Thapsus. The elephants in that battle were actually commanded by Titus Labienus, so the Magister Equitum, so the cavalry commander per excellence that had been once faithful to Caesar and passed in Gaul, and that was basically the most famous cavalry commander at that point. In that generation, like at least that we know of. Well, he was in charge of elephants. Well, Caesar simply countered them with archers, and elephants done, and Caesar wins the battle of Thapsus, and there were even the coins with the written Caesar and the image of the elephant when he came back to Rome for the African triumph. So you see that what is interesting, especially about the employment of these elephants, is that they were still effectively functional, in that these local kings, fundamentally in North Africa, even after the destruction of Carthage, and it had, especially the Numidians as tribes, had compacted around sort of monarchies essentially, and were keeping to use them, and the same Romans were using them, right? So still at that point, they would keep even thinking to use them, even though they would become to just theory, like in the 1st century AD. Even the employment of elephants was theorized, but in practice we don't see them much of that. In general, this can be explained from a Roman perspective, in the sense that after the civil wars and the beginning of the Principate, the Roman army was normalized at one point, for which the even auxiliary forces were normalized and professionalized in one form, and in this rationalization, there was no room for this kind of just readily available troops that had characterized a bit the centuries of Roman expansion from the 3rd century BC onwards, for which Rome began basically to use en masse these troops. Like, they wanted to have troops that were effective, regular, and the elephant, this in theory, it has still obviously retained its offensive capabilities. You still find them, used by the Sassanids later on, but at the same time, they are kind of an eccentric arm that it was useful. It proved to be useful, but at the same time, you can do better with something else, right? There are inherent risks, as we were saying before, for employment of elephants. There have been debates relatively to the employment of especially of towers, especially from the side of the Carthaginian elephants themselves, right? A scholar, for example, said that probably Carthaginians didn't use towers on their elephants. And the reason being that effectively there is no reliable textual reference to them, right? When the Ptolemies at Raphia needed to crewmen specifically to protect the elephant and driver from Seleucid elephant crewmen, as we've seen, but the Carthaginians didn't have any special need in this sense. They weren't fighting against peoples that had elephants on their own, right? The Romans didn't have them. The Europeans broadly didn't have them. The Numidians weren't much of a match, and actually they didn't have the capabilities, the logistics, the level of centralization to field large amounts, masses of elephants. Like even the Carthaginians that were fairly wealthy, as we know, and they very wealthy actually, and they made large employment. They spent a lot for the military. Effectively, of the most different types of units, right? In this sense, the Carthaginians, nothing to do with Alexander, but they're fully Hellenistic in warfare, because they were actually the ones who received at the fullest and probably to the greatest benefit the Hellenistic notions of warfare, and that's how you have Hannibal, telling you the truth. So we have to talk about Hellenism in warfare, because also this is important for the history for military history in general, and understanding why the Carthaginians even received these this culture, this notions, this idea, and then were effectively able to replicate them and even enhance them over time. Against this theory of scholars, we can't say that, however, there are several works of art that do show Hannibal's elephants specifically as towered, right? Including a statuette from Pompeii, which is, I think, the only, at least it's the most consistent source we have, because it's an actually surviving statuette which shows tridimensionally, evenly, and pretty and sizably also the details of what the towered elephant was really about. And the Numidians, so there is this doubt about it. How was it represented? Like, and probably there is no reason to think that such types of turrets weren't used, right? Maybe you can say, I don't know, in Pompeii there were kind of Hellenistic models that were imported even in art that showed towered elephants, like it was more likely to happen in Asia. It's possible. We don't know. We also don't know actually whether the function of these towers is a strictly tactical one, but maybe just it was for commanders to observe the field, telling the truth. So there are many, also because the statuette, if you look at it, there is no one in the tower. Like, there is the mahout on the neck of the elephant, on the nape of the elephant, but there is a tower. There's also pretty sizable and tall, right? It's chained basically to the elephant with these three chains that pass from the neck, the belly and the backside, right? But at least to me, it doesn't inspire particular stability. There have some problems physically here, gravitationally, to accept this. But you see that there is a shield also on the side, so we don't know. This is art. This is not reality, but it's fairly detailed to show actually something that is pretty plausible, yet that it doesn't have necessarily to do with tactical effectiveness, whether the Carthaginians actually used towers against, for example, the Romans in the famous battles of the Punic Wars. Talking about the Numidians, as we were saying before, they didn't have also no specific pressing need for towers of crewmen. But we have seen also that they used them. There is evidence of that, and probably they must have learned their elephant techniques from Carthage, which is plausible. So for the Numidians, the idea is that probably, yeah, they knew elephants, they traded them, whatever. But the Numidian military was essentially based on light cavalry. Point. Having an elephant in there means that you have some form of political centralization that initially the Numidians did not have. They start compacting, even thanks to kind of Roman influence and etc. Also Carthaginian influence for that matter, but especially after the Second Punic War, where the Romans tried to kind of find a single referential king. Eventually, the same Romans will fight against the Numidians, but the Numidians remain there because essentially, yeah, the province, there will be a Roman province of further stabilization, but it's still this kind of semi desertic area in most of the places that didn't really see the rise of a consistent kind of local structured power, right? So, but the idea is that you, in order to have an elephant, you have to have a freaking lot of money in the first place if you want to use it. It can be useful. Elephants are can be actually employed even as sort of tanks. They're even useful in siege warfare, for example, especially in a place like North Africa where you can imagine it, aside from the major cities on the coasts, you don't even have kind of stone walls. You have just palisades, wooden walls, and if you send elephants just to make it pull down people and parts of the walls, etc. So we know that this happened elsewhere many times. It's just that I think it's rightfully not normal to have such information for such an early time in places that nobody actually cared anything at all. Like the Romans, even when they had to fight eventually in Numidia, like that was one of the first wars the Romans didn't actually give basically anything about. They didn't even know what Numidia was, and these were kind of primitive peoples by certain standards at the outskirts of the world. So the actual documentation is relatively low, right? We have a few, thanks to the Romans, we actually know a fair amount about the Numidians themselves, but still, we shouldn't be surprised if we don't have such a huge amount of information and details about this. Yeah, and probably even think about the elephants as a way to show off. We know of parades, for example, where towers were even used, or not, right? Some have said, well, yeah, there are coins, for example, representing elephants moving without towers, and that can be an actual proof that maybe the towers were not employed because we're talking about a parade, and not about actual tactical employment. These are just speculations. We simply don't know. It could also be the other way around. And this is, in my opinion, especially possible with the African elephant, because effectively it's a smaller animal. Why do you have to load it? Even think about certain battles. Elephants were how were elephants employed normally? Well, the idea was, first of all, to deploy elephants at the center, right? When you think about tactics, we always have to think usually at the simplest way to deal with these things, because elephants in the center, being erratic animals that could deviate by their own initiative, telling the truth, and there was no way to make them change direction, where at this point the safest way you could employ them, right? If you, for example, deploy them on the flanks, on the wings, well, the chance that these could take also the lateral way of the field was higher. So there is an economy here you have to conceive. Then how do you actually employ an elephant when you have to throw it, I don't know, against Roman legions, as the Carthaginians did, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, because also the Romans adapted. Think about famously what Scipio does at Zama, where he creates these corridors between the in his ranks, for which when elephants charge, basically they bottle them into them, and they simply pass through the legions without too much harm, and also exposing the sides and the behind, where we have seen how vulnerable they were. But what is more interesting at this point is, what did the elephant have to do? Yeah, okay, it had to smash essentially into the enemy lines. How did this happen? Well, first of all, the elephant is so heavy that you don't really need to launch him at full speed, right? I don't know how much elephants can run, honestly, but I think it's, the idea here is not much of the speed, but simply in the first place maintaining the unity of the formation to maximize the effect, right? And what do you want is columns, right? Columns for which you can really create certain big gaps among the units that cannot close just because just one elephant gets in through them. That already makes a lot of damage, but really making past lots of elephants, right? Now, through the enemy formation, creating this gaps, you can eventually, if not exploit, at least you mess up the enemy formation, which is the most important thing in the first place, even if you don't actually exploit them, because people are obsessed that, I don't know, in these battles, everything was about exploiting the gaps, even between the units, but that's telling the truth, it's nonsensical, right? The gap at that point has to be at least as large as another unit in order to be meaningfully exploitable, right? There are people who even said such amenities like that the Romans defeated the Macedonian phalanxes because there were these gaps between the various units, and that they exploited them. It doesn't work like that in real warfare, right? It's much more messed up and much more complicated even to enact, and with which advantage, telling the truth. But aside from this, and it's complicated. There is no mechanicistic explanation and positivistic explanation when we talk about warfare. Those things are complete delusions in general. But they're so widespread and kind of popular exactly because nobody really gets much about these worlds in the first place. But in general, elephants were deployed in columns, right? And they formed columns of some animals that were led by a female in heat. Yes, that was the trick. How do you make elephants following another elephant? You put a female in heat in front of all the other male elephants are gonna follow her. Right? I don't know whether they were tied as well to maintain information. Probably. They were usually distanced in, say, by 5-6 meters, right? And these columns also were at good distance the one from the other, like 20 meters, very likely. And the main problem was maintaining as possible the cohesion, also widening in this sense. Like 20 meters are enough for kind of crushing effectively an enemy unit in a consistent amount along its front line, right? So, and it's still enough not to make the elephants kind of stumble with each other, etc. You can identify clearly what is happening, which line it is, so that they don't get confused. Consider that so here they were launched literally like this, and the main problem was if the elephant freaked out and began to run amok, and then he was nailed in the head by the Mahout in that case, because if it turned against your own troops, well, that could happen. You don't really want that, and naturally, in order to do that, the Mahout had to be on the back of the elephant. So it's also a kind of suicidal idea, and that's why, coming back to the idea of the turret, the point is you have this row of elephants that more or less follow the leader instinctively. What's the point of needing to load these elephants with like towers that are an extra weight even for bringing these troops, for generally make them feel even more comfortable? If you know that you're gonna launch, like it happened during the Punic Wars, these elephants straight into the enemy formation, how do you think even who is on the elephant is gonna survive? So naturally, there was a lot of suicidal elements in this regard, because at least the mahouts had to know what they were going towards. But the idea is also that hopefully the elephants would literally pass through the enemy formation completely. But it's still something extremely risky, and so sending so many troops into the midst of enemy lines, knowing that they're gonna be butchered down, well, it doesn't seem much of a great advantage, right? The mass of the elephant per speed is already enough for what you really want to cause in the enemy formation, to simply disorder them. And then you can exploit that with other bodies of troops, but not that are running literally after the elephants. Actually, we have evidence of something like this in certain cases, but these troops were not actually shock troops like Stoßtruppen, like to follow into the gaps formed by the elephant. It was just for defending the elephant themselves, that at a certain point could even stop naturally and began to defend themselves with their tusks, etc. Because the elephant can be trained in that sense to actually harm, and even horses do that. You can imagine elephants with the force they have, what they can do, but not essentially to make lighter infantry, which was the preferred arm to deal with elephants, surround the elephant and hit their butts. That was the real problem. We have seen it in the video about the Battle of Ilipa, for example. That's exactly what was going on between the Romans and Carthaginians at that point. And the Romans usually sent their velites at this point of history to the javeliners to deal with the elephants in that regard, because they're fast troops that lightly armored, they're missile throwers, and therefore that they're the ideal to do what they have to do against the elephant. So in this whole picture, I think that in order to, and that is important because if that's the only way you can effectively knock out an elephant in practice. Yeah, you can even trouble him with other missile, but it's not. We know the technicalities of how this happened. I was thinking about the Caesar tapses. Like, we don't know how effectively these arrows were used, whether they were maybe fire arrows, like just to freak out the animals or something like that. But it is the javelin, and this is the average of the story, and we know from other sources this was the case, that normally elephants had their own tiny guards, but they were light infantry at their own way, right, and not just massive like troops that were designed to follow the elephant into the enemy midst. Then you need another rank, another like thick formation, a line of battle to follow on what the elephants have caused on the enemy troops. That's essentially what Hannibal thought to do at Zama, right? In my opinion, Hannibal knew perfectly that he was in pretty dire straits, and he sensed that a battle was going to be bad, but he had not many other options than work like that. And there is always this, division of what happens in the various lines of battle. First one, the other. It's all it's effective as long as you maintain this division, this order, this sequence, right, in the employment of various battle lines, and that's it essentially. So the Carthaginians, for example, in that case at Zama, they simply sent the elephants in front of all. What's the objective of it? It's as if they had employed missile troops. Right, it's as if instead of throwing arrows at the Romans, they had thrown these elephants into them, because it's literally about the shot. It's the sheer force of the animal itself. That's all what it is. You don't need towers to make the elephant so much more effective in these conditions. They have just to charge through the enemy lines. What's the point of putting two guys on on their backs to get slaughtered in the end? Doesn't make much sense. Like, save them among the skirmishers or other troops, right? It's not that the elephants are gonna defeat alone the enemy formation. In fact, in other occasions where the Carthaginians were more successful against the Romans in this regard, they effectively followed the by attacking the Romans were that they were all disordered and crushing them with other troops and mass composed by the rest of the battle lines, right? And that's the sense, the tactical sense of this all. So it's much simpler. It's literally like about you. This thing cannot be stopped. Let's be honest about it. The elephants are gonna charge anyway, and the idea is also. I reviewed, I must say, a bit my ideas on what animals do when they have to charge effectively. We often say, for example, that horses stop when they see an obstacle. Now, this is true, actually, most of the times, but it's not always true, actually. There are certain horses that, in this sense, were probably also trained to literally smash against obstacles. We know that, because horses sometimes even wound themselves in this way. They don't quite rationalize the fact that they're going to impact on something that's going to hurt them. Not all of them. Some get impressed and they have this sense, this instinct of survival. But certain others just go straight against the enemy. And we do know that impacts actually took place. It's mostly like humans that tend to stop and to kind of refrain during the charge if they're scared. Maybe the horses would go on. And the elephants essentially do, at that point, similar things. That naturally... the problem at that point is not that the elephant is such an effective mean after you stop its charge, right? It's gonna the most important thing is block the charge, is put the enemy into a condition in which he cannot use it because for a matter of space, because you can't optimize at that point the this is also what I often say, a battlefield is not a basketball floor, like field. You don't always have the space to carry out certain maneuvers to make things work. So it has all to be calibrated in a very simple way, and elephants can do a very few things after all, right? But that only thing that is charging straight at the enemy, you have to maximize its effort without getting too much concern about the details. And this is why I think the towers specifically do not seem to me to have a particularly effective role, right? I can see even maybe in siege warfare that you want to attack the enemy walls of wood around a palisade, being on a tower and targeting the enemy from the above. Yeah, that makes sense. But just to think that by standard elephants had towers just in every situation, every tactical situation, I don't think it really makes sense. And if they have to charge, after all, it's not such a great idea, in my opinion. Then we simply don't know. So this is just the juice of my considerations about it. Another thing that is interesting to think about is that the same Carthaginians originally didn't make use of elephant. Like, it's something relatively late in time. And the same use of towers actually would appear very late. We think that the Carthaginians, as for other things, were schooled in the Hellenistic warfare by Pyrrhus. Like, it's possible, if anything, the Carthaginians learned how to use towers and also conceiving the maximizing the effective employment of elephants in the first place by Pyrrhus himself from his Italian and Sicilian campaigns, right? There are then lots of sources of later times that do mention Carthaginian towers, right? This could be, however, really mere literary commonplace. And it's true that, for example, certain coins, as we've seen, show Punic elephants with drivers only, right? With driver, actually, just one man, Mahut. But once again, we don't know. Were they used in battle, on a march? Sir, I think the general feeling is today among scholars that it's highly probable that Carthaginian elephants did in fact use towers, right? Possibly containing up to 2 javelin, as Pyrrhus actually seems to have done. But it ends there, and when you consider this option, always think that what the advantage of it all could be, and in which situation this was. And just think in general that aside from like the ancients at this point were obsessed literally with pitched battles, right? Pitched battles were fairly rare. Or if we see the ancient world like this clashes among so many people all at once, it wasn't such a different world actually from later times, right? Never think it was this enormous potential in the ancient world as we sometimes think. So there is, and we get from ancient historiography mostly information about these pitched battles. Like we get, if you look at Polybius, strategically speaking, we know a lot about how campaigns were waged, how even about details about combat, but the latter are kind of scanty overall. So we don't have to be so highly concentrated just on the pitched battle employment. We have to reason more broadly, and just we tend to lack information at that point. But just consider always the thing from kind of an economical point of view, not from a strictly monetary one, like from that time, but economically speaking, in terms of energies, in terms of functionality. Right, this is very important. There are lots of things you can make an elephant do, and just reducing the thing to a standard employment of the elephant, plus loading him characteristically speaking with the tower, but it's not necessarily the best way you can conceive it, the thing. And once again, do not try to stress all the time analogies with later times. We're talking about different species, we're talking about different warfare in general, right? That's the single most important thing. Not everything is the same everywhere, right? It also related to the availability of elephants in the first place. As I was saying before, actually, for example, even Numidian kings might have displayed elephants simply because that was a sign of, look, I have these beasts, because I know, as a king, I have finally my own stables, I have my own revenue, so I'm powerful, I'm cool. Could be even just a status thing in certain situations. We do know that elephants were employed, militarily speaking. We know the Romans actually employ elephants, and this is often overlooked. The most famous Roman employments of elephants are at the Battle of Cunos Cephalae, 197 BC, at the Battle of Magnesia, famously against Antiochus III. This is interesting because we're in a fully Hellenistic context here, and the Romans at this point were showing off. They had elephants. Now it's not that the elephants did much in those battles, as we know. But, well, actually, yes, they were able, apparently, even to strike them, especially at Magnesia. But the idea is that, think at it also, look, we Romans not only have the guts now to actually come in to fight against Alexander's hares, let's say, but we also have elephants, like Pyrrhus had done, and that was very important. It was about having these models and showing these orientality that was really a thing at the time. We've made a video the other day about talking about the Eastern influences in Roman literature after the Second Punic War. These were important things. The Romans at that point had to prove that they were at the same level of these great Hellenistic rulers, and employing therefore also these kind of exotic means that had been like that for the Romans, and up to 100 years before hadn't even known elephants, the proving therefore something that goes beyond the mere tactical functionality. It was evidently there, because otherwise they would not use them in the first place, but it also means something more. As we were saying before, the Romans would keep employing elephants. Interestingly enough, these are always Numidian elephants, right? These are always African elephants the Romans got from their Numidian allies, right? They figure prominently in general. Numidian cavalry was also very prized. The Numidians had an important space, especially in the second and the first century BC. Since the Second Punic War, since the end of the third, in Roman armies, right? This is quite meaningful because it seems at that point that the Numidians themselves were seeing even the employment of elephants as a mean to, satisfy the Roman requests from a political and military point of view as allies, etc. So, but it's not that there was a huge investment in elephants as a structural arm, like an integrated arm that at that point made really a big difference. Like the army that went the closest to this was objectively the Carthaginian one, but not even in there, possibly also a bit the Seleucids because they had more, greater accessibility to India. The Indians basically gifted, showered the Hellenistic kingdoms with elephants as diplomatic gifts because they were simply full of elephants everywhere. And but we can't objectively talk about an integrated system of arms. The closest that comes to that is objectively Carthage, but still the elephant in itself is it's part of a broader military philosophy that sees the employment of everything that is available to tactically achieve through the coordination of all these various arms a common success. This is really the Carthaginian school. That is actually the apex of Hellenistic school, right? What was not accomplished in terms of tactical school by the Alexandrine legacy was accomplished by Hannibal before and during the Second Punic War. And there are people who say after that nobody really actually added anything to tactics, and till today, and it's objectively true. But this is a message that I think falls largely on deaf ears in most people today because they don't understand what it means properly, right? For people, it's mostly about technology that makes the difference, and that's the eternal mistake that we keep falling to again and again and again and again. It has nothing to do with that. That's why if you really have to study a campaign in absolute terms, a war just once in your life, you really want to feel what it is, study the Second Punic War, because that's literally the single most complete campaign you can ever find. The war that you can ever find all over military history. There is no other, didactically speaking, that's perfect. That's simple perfection, and it shows you what the difficulty that existed at the time in actually reaching the peaks of this military sophistication, right? We will have to make a video about this specifically because it really deserves. I never addressed these topics directly, but I will always let you feel as if there was something to say, and there is indeed a lot to say about it. But just for saying that, for once, that to make it simple, for once that you see something happening, that doesn't mean, first of all, that we actually know what it went like, but secondly, that it was the standard, right? Even in these tactics, these armies operated in what they had at the moment. They experimented indeed, but most of what happens is contingental. Right, warfare is not a place where you can make tests like in a laboratory and thinking that let's just see what happens. Yeah, there are much more important things you're thinking at the moment, including not really testing, but simply. If there is really no better choice, maybe, and that's where also genius comes from, and that's why you used to study Hannibal and Scipio during the Second Punic War, but. Also because it's the ensemble, let's say, it's the whole doctrine, but also ingenuity that's gonna make the difference, not the single element as such. And that's what was achieved actually at this point in military history, at the end of the 3rd century BC in the campaign in Italy, Africa, and Spain, and that literally changed the history of warfare forever. In a way, it's really not changed up to this day, and it can't be changed, I think, at many levels. Anyhow, once again, we will talk about this. So, a bit more information on the mahouts and what we think about the towers themselves and how they were done. So, Hasdrubal mahouts at the Metaurus River carried a mallet and chisel, with which they could kill the elephant, as we said before, with a swift blow to the base of the skull, so it's instant death. If it went amok and attacked his own men. So that's really the problem, as we have seen. And it was very, very consistent. You can't stop the elephant. Think about a world where you have, this is literally a tank, but even today we have means to stop tanks. At the time, there weren't many, right? Especially in open field. So this was a necessity that could save a lot of lives at the same time. Hasdrubal is generally credited with this. Also in here, it's a voice, but here, hey, we have it. There are no other hints, so we take it historically as an anecdote, but it's probably also true, because like this is a precaution you have to think at. Maybe it was already present before, it was present in other people's, yeah, it's okay, but for the West we have a source that tells us for this time, so that's meaningful, and that's what we have to appreciate historically speaking. But it seems from that occasion that it was a recent innovation, though, at least from what we can get. Talking about the tower proper, well, it was probably made of hides stitched over a wooden framework. The statuette from Pompeii is actually what is displayed in there. It seems as if it's built of tons of big bricks, right? It's simply probably was made. There was the skeleton and this kind of either hides, sewn hides, and or maybe on other, at least for Indian elephants, were kind of wooden turrets, right? Probably like filled in wood, like on all the sides. And in the statuette, as we have seen, also there were chains. I've always been dubious about the stability of that thing. And yeah, that's pretty much it. And I don't think there is much else to say. Would be always something more to say talking about this. And yeah. Okay, so I think we can stop it here. I don't know how these videos turn out, because I basically stopped even planning them. Like, I read a bunch of things and then I can't remember other things I come up with, I simply do the video. But I think it makes some sense, and there are actually a very few and simple flashes, right? But the important, as always, in history are not facts. People are obsessed by facts, and then they don't know what to do with them. The important is their interpretation, which is a wholly different thing, and is a much more theoretical thing to do, in the sense that it must build up a theory like that stands on its feet, which is not just abstraction or speculation, which instead is often done when in fact you have just facts but you don't know how to interpret them, so you start inventing weird things just to fit your narrative or your limits in a way. And definitely we will make other videos about I don't know, the Indian elephant at some point. Maybe talk also more about towers, because this was a kind of a digression today, because we had to talk about them. We're talking about African elephants, but there's really a lot to say about it, and it was full of there are several sources about this topic, because the elephant, especially in the Hellenic-based literature of the time, was part of the set of kind of technical things that aroused the Greeks in some way. The Greeks were really very careful about describing certain, and they transmitted to certain Roman historiographers this passion for technology as such, right? But that's a prejudice that, as Westerners, as heirs of the Greeks, we do keep, right, this obsession, in fact, for technology. We are also fortunately here of the Romans, so the thing gets balanced, because there is also a practical side that is often untold, that is more tied to practice. It's very interesting how this fits all in the things we discuss on this series on the Funkriege. When we talk about von Clausewitz, that is telling exactly about this thing. So when historically speaking, always bear in mind, as we were saying at the beginning of the video, which source you use, why they write that, from which mindset they come, and what's the purpose of that information in the first place, right? At the time, considered that we're talking about a time in which Hellenistic warfare was considered the most advanced in the world. Here, Rome was yet to be, like, it's with the Second Punic War that effectively Rome shows its full potential and goes on to effectively win against the Hellenistic armies, right? And there's this enormous debate that is probably and strangely but meaningfully, in my opinion, the most highly debated things on the internet, when everybody comes, the typical thing, Manipular Legion versus Macedonian phalanx, yeah, that's the thing, maybe. But at the end of the day, that's also it's explained mechanicistically. It's explained very often just through, and on the wake of Polybius, that dedicates explicitly, I think, a chapter was onto the confrontation between the phalanx and legion, and he tries to make sense as a Greek, right, with a lot of positive and rationalizing intent, into in finding a solution of whether saying, okay, this had to happen in this way, because it was a big question at the time of Polybius himself, that eventually was a captive himself. He adopted in the circle of the Scipiones, that had to write, also always bear it in mind, to make a service for the Romans in this regard. But as a Greek, he reasoned in a way that highlighted certain specific mindsets that the Romans, had they written more at that time, had they had an actual historiography at that point on the same events Polybius described, would have described the thing in a very different way, maybe with much less details technically, and in fact speaking, and also with less rationalizing intent, but probably showing instead a moral dimension that is effectively what also Polybius actually gets and explains pretty well, but that is generally much more central in the economy of history, I would say, when looking at warfare and trying to make sense of it, because not everything has to make sense. Not everything that happens must have it had to go that way. It would have gone that way anyway. I wrote my own thing back in the day, the confrontation between Manipular Legion and Macedonian phalanx, and I came out with a substantial impression that, and I don't tell you what, but that there's absolutely no deterministic way you can read those things. You can definitely appreciate the probable superiority of a certain system over the other, but at the same time that war, as always, is dictated by factors you can't foresee, right? You can have a system that is better predisposed to cope with certain unknown things, unpredictable things, but it's still not enough. It's never enough. There is no military system that is capable of coping with the uncertainty of war at fullest, so that it has to win necessarily. So that's why certain questions are very poorly posed, and certain answers at that point are just fanaticism. They're not historical finesse, we can say. But once again, this is not the first time I tell you this when we talk about Hellenistic warfare, but it has to be borne in mind. So this was a digression to explain to you that there is a substantial attention in this mostly Hellenic-dominated literature towards things like elephants, chariots, catapults, right? But still, and the same military history of that time is probably the proof of the most, effective proof of this. That's not how you win a war, necessarily. Look at what happened to the Carthaginians, look at what happened to the Seleucids, look at what happened to other people that thought that that was a big thing. They even spent an enormous amount of stuff on that thing, but that won or lost, at least for reasons that were, for which these elements were virtually insignificant, or that and even made it worse, telling the truth. But even in there, so maybe especially wrote also from this external point of view, was a bit imitating even the same Hellenic historiography at one point, talking about Latin literature. Certain Roman historiographers were trying to make true sense of things like that, those weapons backfired, and that maybe it backfired, but not necessarily from the mechanical point of view that it's often used to make sense, or even to conceal sometimes what happened on a battlefield, which indeed happened at the same time. But I hope in the future we will get a bit more in detail in these battles and show you what I'm actually hinting at, because in this way it remains a bit exoteric, mysteric, and doesn't actually satisfy your curiosity if you don't actually know already what I'm talking about. So for today we stop here, and for now I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.